Good morning. Welcome to the Deep 404. I'm going to cover off something today which I hope is going to be the start of a change in an area of Ukraine which has just reportedly been hell. There's some reports coming out that perhaps the beachhead in Krynky in the Kherson region, which is this area on the eastern bank or the left-hand side of the Dnieper River, which the Ukrainians have for the last weeks and couple of months tried to establish a beachhead there. And they have done that. They've been successful in holding some ground in this area of Krynki, but it has come at a terrible cost. And it has long been considered a pointless venture for the Ukrainians in terms of tactical or strategic military value. It has been for the Ukrainians a beachhead on the Russian-controlled side of the Dnieper River. It hasn't been something they've been able to easily access. That they haven't had a bridge to get them across the Dnieper River or then the smaller Kolka River that runs alongside the Dnieper in that area. They've had to access this by boats, the whole time by boats, and there have been so many videos of FPV drone attacks upon boats containing 3 or 4 or 5 Ukrainian men. You might remember a video that we had on the show here from a few months ago, which showed from the view of one of the men on a boat. Some Ukrainians had crossed the river and they were getting off a little pier and into their speedboat and getting out of there. And it was just all guns blazing back at the docks where the Russian forces had been chasing them, had approached them to the docks and were trying to shoot them out of the water. Frightening, frightening stuff, real battle footage. And I think there's been a lot of this going on here. And as the weather has moved from the autumn into the winter, as the temperatures have dropped, the men trying to hold Krynki, the stories of their experience has just deteriorated, become worse and worse. Stories of nearly everyone there suffering from frostbite. Stories from Ukrainian soldiers who have been to Krynki and have managed to survive and be rotated back out. Them talking about not being able to evacuate their dead, not being able to evacuate their wounded, being struck as they try to move back. Recent problems in some of the areas, it seems, where some of the smaller access rivers and streams that they might use to get to Krynki have actually been freezing. Perhaps shallow streams have been freezing, making it difficult for them to complete their approach on boats, and so then slowing them down, exposing them. There's been footage of large Russian bomb strikes on the area. The area of Krynki that is being held is not large. And the footage that you see of Krynki now just shows yet again what happens to small townships in the middle of an artillery war. And what was once a township on the river is now nothing more than rubble. It is just broken tree stumps 4 feet high and rubble, buildings destroyed, and just waste has been laid to the area of Krynki. There have been numerous reports originally coming from, of course, the Russian side and those people with perhaps a more balanced view of what this conflict is about, and now even recently coming from the Ukrainian side, that Krynki has been pointless for the Ukrainians. It hasn't been a military adventure. It has been a PR one or a political one. It seems as though the reason that the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian government has wished to hold Krynki is so that they can claim that they are being successful. They've moved across the Dnieper River. The Russians can't hold them at the river. They can get past that, and they're getting into the Russian territory. They're reclaiming their territory. That truthfully seems to be the sole reason here that Krynki has continued for as long as it has. Now, I'm sure that there were originally plans to get into Krynki and expand a beachhead and be able to funnel in resources and then push down towards Crimea or something like that, cut off some of the land of Kherson and regain some of that land. But it is always going to be a very difficult thing to do, given where it is, having to cross a number of rivers. The idea of moving heavy vehicles across to be able to support you, tanks and equipment and armoured personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles and things like that, demining vehicles, all of that very difficult, if not impossible, for the Ukrainians to be able to do there, given the distance they have to travel, generally along waterways. When you watch a lot of the footage, they are in their boats moving along the snaking estuaries of the river along there. So this puts you on a predefined path. It's like having to approach along a road. The Russians know where they are. They can see them coming. The skies are full of Russian kamikaze drones, it seems. And the battle for Krynki has been a disaster for the Ukrainians. Some reports indicating that there have been 6,000 men, Ukrainian men, lost in Krynki. I don't know if that's correct, but I wouldn't be surprised if you have access to Telegram and you go and look for some of the footage, you look at the footage of Krynki and what's happening there, and you can understand that number of 6,000 seems like it could be quite possible. Anyhow, there are some reports over the last 2 days still of heavy fighting going on in Krynki, but of the Russians advancing, the Russians moving into Krynki. Reports of a Russian group having raised the Russian flag in Krynki, and the Ukrainians being forced back. Now, the reason I'm raising this is because this is just one of the standout battles of many of the battles in this Ukrainian war, but this is one of them that has seemed to be in some ways the most pointless and the most senseless waste of life for pure political and PR reasons. So seeing Krynki come to an end is in some ways a good sign. Good in that perhaps Ukrainian men won't be forced to try to hold this pointless position any longer and lose their lives for that. Good perhaps in that this may be a sign that if Krynki is given up by the Ukrainians, that the government in Ukraine is no longer looking to pursue pointless PR victories like that. And that in itself may indicate that we are getting closer to a conclusion in this conflict. Now, I'm not saying that the conflict is over or anywhere near over, but we do see a lot of factors pushing towards that outcome, that perhaps the current Ukrainian administration is losing its ability to be able to fight this war and continue this war, and that by them recognizing that, or them being forced into that realization, perhaps we will find ourselves getting to a point of negotiations sooner rather than later, and that those negotiations may lead to an end to this conflict. Now, for people who believe that Russia shouldn't be in Ukraine at all and this was a completely unprovoked attack, then of course you may not like the idea of Ukraine having to negotiate anything. But I think that if you are being realistic about this, Ukraine has to negotiate. Well, Ukraine needs to get to the negotiating table as soon as possible. If they do, they may have the chance of ending the fighting with Russia and stop the bleeding white of their nation, of their young men and women in war. I'm not suggesting that they will have a great deal of negotiation power, but they may have at least the option of making the choice of, do we give up the eastern oblasts of Ukraine to the Russians now and accept a loss, and we give that territory up without further bloodshed? Or Do we continue to fight for those Eastern Oblasts and commit more and more of our men of fighting age and now our women to their graves over territory which by all indications we're going to lose anyhow? So I think that's the choice that the Ukrainian people have realistically at this stage facing them. Fight and lose more and give up this ground, or make a strategic decision now, give up this ground now and stop fighting now, and just try to get to a point where perhaps you can somehow repair what's left of Ukraine. Unfortunately, even that I think might be difficult for what remains of Ukraine. The recent security agreement with the UK that Rishi Sunak has announced, in there, if we look at that, there are a number of things which the UK says it will do for Ukraine. It'll help Ukraine get back to its 1991 borders. Some of the things that are in there that the UK are suggesting they will do seem to me as though in order for them to happen, there is a large assumption. And that assumption is that Russia will agree to those things happening, or Russia will somehow be massively defeated and will give up, will surrender, and then Ukraine and the UK will be able to do what they like. Again, in the real world of what we're seeing today, I don't think that is a likely outcome. However, the flip side of that security agreement does say that Ukraine will support the UK if it is needed. And to me, that's what I think that security guarantee is really all about. It is locking Ukraine in to becoming effectively a private military company for the United Kingdom. You might say it's a cynical view, but that's how I read that document. Go and read the document. Lots of things in there, we'll do this, which may not come to fruition to help Ukraine. But item number 7, bullet point 7, Ukraine, you will come to the UK's help. There's talk that President Macron of France is looking at providing a similar sort of security guarantee document for Ukraine. I haven't seen that document yet. I think it's yet to be released, but I would imagine that it has the same quid pro quo in it, where very early on in the piece, Ukraine will be required to support France. Now, the Ukrainian minister, Kuleba, yesterday was in an interview, I think it was at Davos, and I only saw a part of the interview, but he was basically saying there, look, we've provided the best security deal for the United States you could imagine. The United States hasn't had to put a single one of its men into this fight with Russia. And if that's the sort of politician you've got in your nation working for you, you've got troubles. That's my opinion. Because he seems to be saying the quiet part out loud, which is that the US has been able to fight this proxy war against Russia and hasn't lost a man. David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, at Davos at a breakfast this week, has reportedly said, I've already told my American colleagues, you spent 10% of the defense budget, which made it possible to destroy 50% of Russian weapons without a single American life lost. This is simply an excellent result. Excellent result for who? Yeah, I guess this is, apart from the major flaw and the incorrect assumption in what he said, that they have managed to destroy 50% of Russian weapons. I don't know there's any evidence of that. But they have been able to do so without the single loss of a single American life. And this is simply an excellent result. Again, this is, if you're a Ukrainian, this is a slap in the face of the largest magnitude. here you're being told by your apparent ally that, oh, I've been talking to our other allies here, and we've done a great deal here. We've spent 10% of our military budget. We haven't lost a guy. We've degraded the Russians. Oh, just forget about the 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed or wounded. And I say that 500,000 not because I'm just going along with whatever Russian media says, but because this week a Ukrainian interior minister from the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, has come out and said that, and has come out and basically said, look, let's tell the truth here. We Ukrainians, we're losing 30,000 men a month, 1,000 men a day is what we're losing. 500,000 already killed and wounded in this conflict. But no American lives lost, so this is an excellent deal. I think if you look at this, and it's taken perhaps a lot of people to recognise really what is happening here, is that people like John Mearsheimer saw this years ago and warned us and told us about this years ago, that this is what was happening, that the United States would lead Ukraine up the Primrose Path and that Ukraine would be wrecked. And this is what is happening. But even in a more cynical view now is that the Ukrainian people are just being used as a tool, like I say, like a private military company. The United States, the UK got together, figured out, all right, we'll get this conflict going. Because Ukraine's a perfect position for them was a perfect nation for them to start a fight with Russia. Ukraine has always been very divided. If you have looked at some of the survey results taken over the last 10 years in Ukraine, there's a gradient that goes from the west to the east. And in the west, the people there in Ukraine are far more what you would term Ukrainian in ethnicity, belief, and desire to align with the West. And as you come across to the East, it changes to people who are far more Russian in their ethnicity and their beliefs and their desire to be aligned with Russia. So this was a nation that was just waiting to be divided and easily to make unstable and to sort of flip. And that's what happened in 2014 with the coup that was organised by Victoria Nuland and co there. Position where Ukraine is on the border with Russia. The reports from the British Defence Secretary Grant Shapps this week that since 2014 the UK have been training 60,000 Ukrainians in their UK training schools and NATO methods, building Ukraine up, giving them supplies, making them feel strong, getting them to flip their government to become pro-Western, therefore creating tension and a threat with Russia. Here, we'll help you, we'll train you up so you'll be okay in a fight. The Russians saying this is enough, invading in 2022, and then within a month after that, negotiations happening between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which almost saw this conflict end in March or April of 2022. President Zelensky apparently at that time pen on paper with the Russians to sign an agreement to let the eastern oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, become independent. Crimea would stay. Well, that was still going to be worked out, but likely Crimea would stay as Russian. It would have stayed. But they were very close. And then reports are that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK at that time, arrived in Kiev and said, this is not happening. If you want to be Western, you want our support, this is not going to happen. But even better than that, not just all stick, but the carrot being, we will give you whatever you need to take on the Russians and win. Come on, the Russians are weak, not a superpower anymore. You can take them on with our help. You will be the leader of freedom and democracy in Europe. You'll go down in history as the man who defeated Russia. And it seems like Zelensky fell for it, said, okay, tore up the negotiations. And this led to the change in the nature of the Russian military presence over the last 2 years in Ukraine, as they realised that they were no longer going to be able to negotiate logically and get out of this and stop a big fight. They were going to have to fight, and they were going to have to fight the proxy war against NATO and the US. And this is what has happened in Ukraine, and this is what is destroying Ukraine. There's no other way to look at it now other than Ukraine is being wrecked. It's financially, it is in great debt to the Western nations, to the International Monetary Fund. Its debt, much of the money that we've heard about, the aid being given to Ukraine, a lot of that is aid that needs to be paid back at some stage. Now, Ukraine isn't producing much at the moment. Its economy has shrunk dramatically, and that's because, as you can imagine, its access to the Black Sea, ports where it would normally export grain, has been reduced to nothing. Mykolaiv, Odessa, the Ismail port on the Romanian border, on the Danube River there, they're not operating. They're being missile struck and shelled by the Russians at will. And grain from Ukraine is not flowing out. Grain from any of the eastern oblasts where the Russians are in charge, that grain is now going to Russia, not going to Ukraine. They are having troubles getting product in and out of their western borders with Romania, Poland. These nations have been undertaking blockades of the borders with Ukraine because of the fact that the Ukrainian trucking organisations, transport organisations, are offering these sweet deals. They're operating at low cost and in high volumes, lots of them trying to get work. And this is causing problems for the transport industry in the neighbouring nations, so they're blockading and not letting things through. In some cases, there are reportedly lines of trucks at the borders with Ukraine up to 30 kilometres long, waiting for 2 weeks for trucks to pass through. Farmers in the neighbouring nations are also enacting blockades and have been doing that over the last couple of months. Their concern being that the products coming out of Ukraine are at prices which are too low and are undercutting them and killing their business. Ukraine is not getting investment in industry and growth because if any of that investment is anything considered likely to be supportive of the military, then it's coming under Russian missile attacks. And the Russian missile strikes have been hitting Ukraine all over Ukraine. Far into the west, Lvov in the west, right up in the north, and of course around the southeastern front line, anything there is just easy pickings for the Russian drones and missiles. The Ukrainian ability to defend itself through air defence has been degraded significantly. We've had multiple increasing reports of this coming from Ukrainians as we see footage coming out showing that strikes in Kiev are reaching their targets now. Reports of Patriot and NASAM air defense systems being destroyed. Reports of successful Russian strikes on missile depots, where things like Patriot missiles are being held or where Storm Shadow missiles are being held. Storm Shadows and Scalps, the one source of medium-range missile the Ukrainians have, which they are able to use, which they do use when they can, but the Russians are slowly retreating. The Su-24 fighter bombers, which are used to deploy these, and the Russians are slowly destroying the airfields and the missile stockpiles that the Ukrainians have. So the Ukrainians are unable to defend themselves from missile attack, which means that manufacturing industries, assembly industries, repair industries, these locations and facilities where artillery can be repaired, Drones can be assembled, are now prime targets for the Russians. Anyone that's looking to develop a new factory in Ukraine, if the Russians believe that that's going to be used to develop something that might aid military, it might be a new drone assembly factory, that can expect to receive some attention from Russian missiles. And this, in general, puts investors off going into Ukraine. If you've got the option of going to Lithuania, for example, or the Czech Republic or Poland or somewhere like this around that area, or Ukraine, to set up some sort of industry, then you're quite likely to consider one of those other nations because you're not under the immediate threat of being attacked by missiles, or even if it's not a direct attack on the industry you're trying to build up. Just the fact that you have a massive skilled worker shortage in Ukraine, you have no certainty that people working for you won't be drafted into the military, you have no certainty that the energy you require to develop whatever your industry might be will be available, as the Russians have the ability to turn the power off if they wish to across Ukraine. So Ukraine's economy destroyed. Its birth rate is in serious decline. Men away at the front line. Whole generation of men being killed in this conflict. More than 6 million Ukrainians left the country. The population's decreased from 43 million down into the mid-30s somewhere, 34 million perhaps, something like that now. Ukrainian sources are expecting that to decrease even further as the Ukrainian mobilization, this enhanced mobilization law or bill is enacted, which dramatically increases who can be drafted and conscripted into the fight. They believe that will put pressure on people leaving Ukraine, moving to other nations. Ukraine is experiencing the lowest number of school leavers that it's had, and that is meaning that things like universities will be closing. Once things like universities close, it's difficult to re-establish them and get them set up again because the people who work there as lecturers will go away to other nations and look for work. Ukraine has got the lowest number of school entry of children of an age to start school. So the education of this nation is going to be crumbling away. And in another year or two, it is thought that it will decrease even more as the birth rate of Ukraine reaches almost zero. So Ukraine is just being destroyed as a nation. What is being left is going to be fed some aid from the West, fed some military training, fed some military equipment, but I believe that it is actually in the war gaming rooms of the West, when they look at their future scenarios of war with Russia, which they do seem to love the idea of. There are reports now that NATO is warning, NATO, which is a defensive organisation, is warning that Europe must expect full war with Russia within 20 years. We have reports coming out of Poland that this should be considered to be within 3 years, within 36 months. Germany is about to start on its big war gaming exercises, as is NATO. NATO's largest defender exercises are starting in a couple of weeks' time. I reported the other day that they're going to involve 40,000 troops. I've seen subsequent reporting saying that is actually 90,000 troops. And that's going to be centered around Germany, Poland, and then the Baltic states. So Europe is looking for war with Russia. We're not seeing from NATO and these governments of Poland and Germany rhetoric to try to calm things down and make things more peaceful and find a way to stop the conflict. They're talking about more war. And in this war gaming, this is where I believe, looking at the assets that you have, they're looking at Ukraine as a buffer. Just a buffer and a force which, if the Russians do decide to come this way, will chew them up first. They'll be our first line of defence before they can get to us. And, you know, geez, if they get through Poland and they get to Germany, well, it's still, you know, they've got them before they get to us in the UK and the United States sitting an ocean away. The one point I forgot to mention there, the economic challenges, reports coming out, and again, this is coming out from a Ukrainian source which has links to the Ukrainian military and government at high levels. They believe that the debt which Ukraine is amassing now, because its economy is wrecked, the debt that it is having to assume and be able to pay back is going to lead to deals with nations, particularly France was mentioned, for just little things like this. You help us with this little thing, we'll blow away, we'll forget about some of your debt. And what's that little thing? Oh, well, we need a nuclear dumping ground for all of our nuclear waste because we're losing our grip on Africa. You know, Niger has kicked France out and has stopped the uranium supplies that France so desperately needs. France is the nation in Europe which produces the most of its electricity from nuclear sources. And they therefore need somewhere to put their waste. They don't want to put it in France. They'd like to put it back in Africa. If they can't do that, now we see they can't do that anymore because the Russians are moving into Africa. Number of nations, including Niger in Africa, are now openly asking to do military deals with the Russians. They feel that the Russians are the most trustworthy major nation that they can deal with and get security guarantees from and military equipment from. In one case, they are building a 10,000 man capacity military base that they want to invite the Russians to come and fulfill to provide them with some sense of security against Western nations. So the West is losing their grip on Africa and Russia is filling that void. And so the West is looking for other places to be able to dump nuclear waste, and Ukraine looks like it might become the place. And that may become part of that Franco-Ukrainian security guarantee. We will provide you with some weapons at limited export levels and some training and maybe some investment in some sort of industry here after things have settled down. And by the way, we'll get to put our nuclear waste into Ukraine. So Ukraine is being destroyed as a nation. And this is why I was talking about Krynky, because if Krynky is actually ending, if it's coming to an end and the pointless slaughter there is going to be a sign that this conflict is getting closer to some sort of a resolution, and ideally that resolution is one of negotiation and an agreement with a new administration in Ukraine, and that is what it will take, a new administration. President Zelensky has already signed a bill saying that no negotiations will occur with the Russians while President Putin is in power. This indicates there will be a new leadership in Ukraine where the negotiations will occur. Those negotiations with Ukraine will themselves now be proxy negotiations, and I think Foreign Secretary Lavrov has sort of stated that the negotiations will be with the United States, is what they're effectively saying. They know that that's who's really pulling the strings, but they need to come to protect what is left of Ukraine, so that Ukraine doesn't just become destroyed even further. If that doesn't happen, if the Russians are forced to grind their way to the Dnieper to take the Russian control of the oblasts that they wish to, including Mykolaiv and Odessa, to take the ports, and if there is not some sort of peace arrangement after that, and we're left in a conflict where what remains of the western oblasts of Ukraine are in a position of like North and South Korea, where there's never been a real peace there, then this will then be a terrible position for what remains of Ukraine. and Ukraine will become an empty vassal state. It will no longer be a free and prosperous nation. It will become a large barracks for the UK and the US's private military company, which they refer to as Ukraine. So that's how I see things at the present time for the Ukrainians. Now, there's other news that I'll go through here. One thing of interest is that the Russian Duma, the Speaker Volodin there, has called the French ambassador to Moscow. He's been summoned there by the Russian Foreign Ministry due to the recent Russian missile strike on a hotel in Kharkov. This strike had reportedly killed 60 mercenaries and wounded 20 others. And these mercenaries are believed to have been French. So this happened earlier this week on the 16th of January. And the response from the French Foreign Ministry has been that France has no mercenaries, either in Ukraine or anywhere else. So I'm based on the reporting I've seen, I'm fairly confident that this strike was on mercenaries. We haven't seen the Ukrainians come out and say, oh, the Russians destroyed a hotel and just killed 60 civilians. We haven't seen that. We've had previous examples where the Russians have laid missile strikes on hotels and there have been foreign mercenaries working there. One from a few months ago, a large number of them seemed to be Americans. I think it was the 101 Airborne, 1st Airborne. And there was video that came out of the people in the rubble and the people helping them. Lots of Western voices speaking in English and insignia on their shirts and things indicating that they were likely US forces. So this report that there were French mercenaries in Kharkov region, to me, sounds likely. And for the French ambassador to be called to Moscow, again, I think lends weight to this, that this probably did happen. France are definitely still in this fight. President Macron has announced that he is going to be providing 40 more Scalp missiles to the Ukrainians, as well as hundreds of bombs. So aid still coming from the French here. The French, obviously looking to be able to do some damage to the Russians. The French are playing a very risky game here. As I said before, France generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. So you can think of it as 7 out of every 10 homes in France, the light bulbs come on because of nuclear energy. Now, France's primary suppliers of uranium were Niger at around 17% of its supply. I think it's Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan, maybe the other two nations. And they provided roughly about 20% each. So I think collectively those three suppliers, that was over 60%, maybe 70% of France's supply. Niger is no longer supplying that to France. And the other two sources, given where they are placed geographically, I've read that their supply line of uranium to France is under Russian control. So that if the Russians chose to, they could stop that supply to France. Also, still a large percentage of the processed uranium that France uses. So you get uranium out of the ground, you can't use it in your reactor. It's got to be processed, and then once it's processed, you can put it in your reactor. A large percentage of the processed uranium that France uses is processed in Russia. So there's still connections between these nations. And that must be in both Macron and Putin's minds when things like this happen, when Macron says we're going to send 40 more scalps and a whole heap of bombs. President Putin must, I think, at that stage, be going, okay, how annoyed am I by this? Am I going to shut down the supply of uranium to France? Are we going to stop any transfer of processed uranium to France? Because if that were to happen, then France is in deep shit, as they say, because it's now going to have to find other sources for uranium. Now it can do that, can probably come to Australia. Australia's has major supplies of uranium. And that may be possible, but that causes extra cost for the French, possible disruptions. And if the processed uranium stops, again, that becomes tough for France to now find another processor of uranium. If that were to cause problems domestically in France, power not available during the winter, this is the sort of thing which leads to riots. Now, France has already become a very unstable country domestically in terms of the riots that it has. Because France has had, for many hundreds of years, been involved in Africa, having colonies there, and in Asia. One of the things that where I live, one of the things that as an indication of that is that many of the bakeries will be Vietnamese run, and yet they will be French patisserie, French bakeries, because of that mixing of cultures with the French colonising Vietnam. But they've also done a lot of that in Africa. That has seen a lot of African people leave Africa and move to France. And there are cultural challenges emerging in France because of African culture clashing with the French liberal Western culture. That is now starting to cause problems, and you can see the riots that have occurred in France over the last years, but the last 5 or 6 months ago. One which was triggered primarily by the police stopping and shooting of a young man, a 17-year-old man. So France playing a risky game in providing these weapons to Ukraine, and particularly the type of weapons, the scalps, because the scalps or storm shadows, the same thing, are the missiles that have perhaps caused the Russians the most annoyance at this stage, and the ones that could be used to perhaps inflict the most damage within Russia. They have a range of nearly 300 kilometres or thereabouts. So if the Ukrainians get themselves right to the border of Russia and launch those missiles, they could reach a scalp missile, into Russia up to 300 kilometres. They're launched from Su-34s. It's not an easy prospect for them to be able to do that, but one of them could go on a kamikaze run and get as far as it could before it detected it was about to be shot down, and then fire some missiles. In theory, one of those Su-34s might make it into Russia some distance, fire one of them. They'd be unlikely to reach Moscow. I think Moscow is about 450 kilometres from the nearest point of a Ukrainian border. But there are nuclear power plants in areas of Russia between Moscow and Ukraine. One of those could come into range. The Ukrainians have previously tried to attack them with drones and have got very close in some cases. A scalp missile could do damage to one of those and cause problems for Russia. But anyhow, France seemingly allowing French mercenaries into the conflict, and Russia claiming that a large number of them were killed in this strike this week in Kharkov. Other things I mentioned in a video, I even sort of titled it, "Keep an eye on the Suwalki Gap," earlier this week. And then just the day after that, I noticed some articles on Twitter coming out talking about it. If you're watching and not just listening, then what is on the screen there at the moment? Actually, I'll make it easier for you to see. There you go. What this is a map of Poland and Lithuania, and this is a border here where the mouse is moving between Poland and Lithuania. That's the Suwalki Gap. To the west of that is Kaliningrad, which is Russia, and to the east of it is Belarus, which is Belarusian. All those little red cells and that over there are allegedly indicating areas of GPS loss around that area. There is talk that the Russians may have implemented electronic warfare control over the Suwalki Gap yesterday, which resulted in depriving areas of Poland and Lithuania of GPS capabilities. So, as I say, to me, I'm not surprised that this sort of thing has happened. The Suwalki Gap is an important piece in, I think, future developments in this conflict. This other image here is from the Telegraph, British newspaper. And what it's talking about here is the Suwalki Gap in the middle here near number 6. Poland to the south, Lithuania to the north, the Baltic Sea to the west of Kaliningrad, Belarus to the east. And what they're talking about here is a possible set of scenarios, set of activities or steps that might lead to a full NATO conflict, and being based around the Suwalki Gap. Now, Suwalki Gap is important because it is what separates Kaliningrad from Belarus and then from Russia. So there are Russian forces in there. There are Russian people in Kaliningrad, and the gap is the land bridge between them. Now, if something were to happen to Kaliningrad, then the Russians would try to bridge the Suwalki Gap, get through there, and join and support. Now, the Suwalki Gap itself is only 62 kilometres long. It's not long, and it's easily covered by sort of short-range missiles stationed close by. If any conflict were to arise, Belarus will follow Russia's lead and support Russia in breaching the gap if that's needed. Now, if the Suwalki Gap were to be taken by the Russians, then what that means is that the NATO nations above it, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are now cut off. They can't run down into Poland anymore. They're cut off by Russia and Belarus. They would be surrounded. They have the Baltic Sea on one side, and then they've just got Russia and Belarus all around them. So this is a concern for NATO that might happen. So both parties are concerned here. NATO's concerned they might have 3 of their NATO nations cut off, and Russia is concerned that it might have its oblast of Kaliningrad cut off and isolated, because Kaliningrad is surrounded by NATO. Apart from Sweden, which is opposite it, across the Baltic Sea, but Sweden is all but a NATO member at this stage. in the big NATO Defender exercises, the largest ones that they've ever had, which is happening starting in 2 weeks' time, Sweden is being included in that along with the 31 NATO nations. 31. It's being included, so it might as well be. It's going to be using NATO technology and communicating and interacting with NATO during these exercises. There is a Nordic Defender set of exercises, which is kicking off a few weeks after that, which is involving, I think, 14 nations, but it's primarily around Sweden, Finland, are going to be involved, and Norway in that one. So Kaliningrad, a very important, delicate piece of this puzzle as Poland and Germany talk about war, as NATO talks about future war. We will see a build-up in this area. There were reports from earlier this week of footage in Poland showing a train carrying a large number of NATO pieces of equipment, sort of armoured vehicles, maybe strikers or something like that, heading towards the border with Belarus. Belarus has just announced that it is going to modify its military doctrine around the use of tactical nuclear weapons. These are the tactical nukes which Russia provided to them last year and positioned in Belarus. This is an area to watch. I think the Suwalki Gap is likely, if things do continue, to become a hotspot and may become a point where the actual NATO involvement in this conflict begins. We'll see. Steadfast Defender. That's the name of the NATO exercises that are coming up, and along with Poland and Germany, who have recently been in the papers talking about the fact that they're preparing for war, that war is coming, that they're starting war games, that they think war with Russia will come within 36 months. There are also reports from a Swedish source that the Swedes are being told this within Sweden, that they are being told to prepare. Mikael Volterson, who is an ex-Swedish Air Force member, interesting commentator on Twitter. He has been suggesting and corroborating from what I've seen from another Swedish source that the Swedes are being told to prepare for war. So definitely that rhetoric is starting to heat up. And this does make some sense if you want to keep the war machine turning, and you're losing the fight with Ukraine on its own, then maybe you do need to finally, once you've chewed up the Ukrainians, pull in the next layer. And so something around the Suwalki Gap would be a good way to pull in Sweden, pull in Lithuania. Well, maybe you pull Sweden in first, and maybe this is what's going to happen here, because Sweden isn't NATO yet. Sweden's getting all of the treatment. Come to NATO, we want you in. But damn it, Turkey and Hungary just won't let you in because you've been burning the Quran and you've been housing members of the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist group, as the Turkish consider them. But we'll support you. You get into it. You're right across the water from Kaliningrad. Have a little go. Start the fight with Kaliningrad and we'll support you. And again, the benefit of this is that NATO can then support at a distance. They can use up the Swedish troops. They don't have to get into the fight because they're not NATO. They can't call Article 5. Not yet. This is, again, I'm being cynical, but then in some respects strategic, because you think about it. If Ukraine is chewed up, and we want to continue the fight against Russia, well, let's use Kaliningrad. We know that if we strike Kaliningrad, the Russians will go and take the gap. We're going to have a fight with them there. We'll be able to engage their troops. Belarus will get into this. We'll get to attack Belarus. We can fight now. We can extend the line all up along the Polish line. Poland won't necessarily fight. We'll get into it. Or if we do get some missiles flying over us over the Suwalki Gap. We'll just say we don't want to escalate anything. But Sweden, you get in there, you attack. We'll support you to get in there because you're not NATO yet. So we don't have to pull everyone else in or look weak if a NATO nation is engaged and attacked and we don't call Article 5 because we're not ready for it. So Sweden needs to be very careful that they're not just becoming the next Ukraine in this conflict. This conflict and just general Western governments at this stage aren't doing great. Just one article which I saw this week about UK steel production. So the owners of the Port Talbot Steelworks have rejected a plan by the trade unions which would have looked to have kept its blast furnaces running. As an aside, this is going to put 3,000 jobs at risk. But this steelworks shutting down in the UK, if this is what happens, will put the UK on course to become the only major economy in Europe that can't make steel from scratch. The company who owns this steelmaking plant has said, even though it's getting £500 million help from the government, that it could no longer afford to continue production at the loss-making plant in the south of Wales while it completed a 4-year transition plan to greener production. So these green policies of Western nations that we've got to move away from fossil fuel, we've got to move away from nuclear energy because they're bad. We've got to move to solar and wind and these green renewables is having real impacts on industry. Heavy industry doesn't like the up and down power supply that you get from wind and solar. It likes the constant heavy duty supply that you get from oil and coal and nuclear. Now, I don't believe that there is a climate emergency. I think it's a load of shit. I do believe we have a problem with pollution, which we should be addressing as a planet, getting rid of plastics in our oceans and our waters. I do believe we've got a problem with our fishing, overfishing, that we need to manage that better. But I don't believe we have a climate problem. And so I don't believe the emissions from coal-fired plants are problems. I don't believe that on the whole that nuclear power generation is a dirty or bad power source. I think that if you look to modern nuclear power generation, that's the way for the world to develop, gain the power that it requires to progress. And this is for all nations, not just the Western developed nations, but for all nations. For them to rise up and get out of poverty and gain wealth, they need access to cheap power and electricity. The best way to do that is with nuclear power. And this is what we should be looking at. Now, Germany, suffering, it's turned all its nuclear reactors off and it's deindustrializing and it's having many of its factories, big industrial factories shutting down and moving out of Germany. And it's a direct result of those sort of policies. The UK here is starting to suffer. Steel production requires heaps of energy. The company can no longer survive while it continues to make a move to a greener production process. It needs to just be supplied with nuclear power, and then you could keep producing steel. These sort of things are happening all across Europe, apart from those nations which are now catching on and saying, oh, we need to increase our nuclear generation. Now, Canada has actually done that. Canada has recently stated that it's going to increase its nuclear generation capabilities significantly. China is doing this. China is even having discussions with Saudi Arabia about providing them with nuclear power generators, that sort of thing. Now, this will come. There was a lot of hype, around nuclear power being horrible and terrible and dirty and dangerous. And there have, of course, been incidents. There's been the Chernobyl incident. There's a Fukushima one, which occurred when the earthquake happened. Yeah, these are undesirable, 100%. But these are uncommon. And Chernobyl happened back in the 80s. Since then, we've come a long way in design, fail-safe design of nuclear reactors. So developing nuclear reactors now are developed in ways that those sort of things don't happen. You don't have those risks. And they're greatly reduced. I'm not saying they're removed. Nothing's perfect. But solar generators, solar power has a problem too. Like solar power is great. And you listen to Elon Musk and he tells us how much energy comes from the sun in a single day. If we could harness that, we could run everything that we need to off solar. And I agree, we could. But the challenge is the infrastructure, developing the batteries to do that, developing the solar panels. The process of developing the solar panels isn't clean. The process of developing the batteries isn't clean. Everyone's seen the pictures of the mines with all the little kids gathering up the heavy rare earth metals that are required to produce the batteries. There's not enough copper mines on the planet to be able to produce enough copper to move the world to use solar. Like, it's a great idea. And Elon's right. That much energy every day does come to the earth that could supply our power needs for a year. But we are hundreds, if not thousands of years away from being able to produce the batteries and the copper required to do that. But we are today capable of using nuclear power to give enough energy to the planet to allow everyone to grow. And that's what we should be focusing on. And again, some people here will be just going, oh, you just think nuclear is great and you think there's no problem with nuclear. So, no, as I've said, there's problems with everything. But you also, if you're all into the green power thing, you also need to admit that wind power is variable, which means that it's not a reliable source. Because if it's windy, you're getting power. If it's not windy, you're not getting power. Wind generation has a problem on, if you're worried about birds. Birds don't like big spinning turbines. It kills a lot of birds. Apparently, sea-based wind generators cause problems for whales too, which is not a good thing. And if you compare the footprint that you need to produce energy, and you look at how you can do that, the footprint, like the amount of land you actually need to clear or take up and manage and maintain with a nuclear reactor compared to solar capture compared to wind, you're talking about massive areas, hundreds and thousands of square kilometres to be able to do what nuclear reactors can do. So you produce one nuclear reactor, you take up a little bit of land, and you're producing consistent high power reliably all the time. You set up a massive area of wind turbines, then all the birds in that area have got challenges. You've got to maintain thousands of wind turbines. You've got to maintain the connectivity between thousands of wind turbines. These aren't cheap to produce. The materials in them aren't particularly friendly for the environment. You've got to figure out what to do when they break, how you get rid of all the waste material from them. You've got the same challenge with solar panels. Solar panels don't break down really well. They've got challenges with recycling them. And if you want to produce as much as you can from a nuclear power plant, you now need to take a whole heap of land, which you could have perhaps grown trees on, or turned into parkland, or turned into housing. You need to now cover it with solar panels. So there are no, Thomas Sowell says it right, there are no solutions. There are just trade-offs. There are trade-offs. Do you want to have the low risk that there may be a nuclear problem in somewhere in the future, or the large risk that you've got to waste all this land to put solar panels on it? There's trade-offs. There needs to be both. There needs to be solar panels legislation perhaps put in place that in all cities, all rooftops get solar panels on them. Because that kind of makes sense. If you've already got a building there, put a solar panel on top of it and absorb that energy locally for that building. That makes sense. When it's nighttime, then you fall over to the main power supply, which is powered by nuclear. You have wind generation where it makes sense in areas where it's not going to impact animals on a large scale and where that land is perhaps difficult to use for anything else. And it makes sense. Use that there, use that locally to provide power in that local area. But put nuclear where you can and let everyone prosper for having lots of cheap nuclear energy. Anyhow, we're seeing problems with these green policies impacting Europe. And again, that's part of the problem they're having with trying to defeat Russia. Russia's got nuclear power plants. Russia will be talking to China about modern technology and building new ones as it needs new power. All right, I just want to go and just talk quickly then of summary about what has happened in the last week on the front line in Ukraine. But just before I do that, if you give me a moment, I will just find one little video that I wanted to show you, which you may have already seen. Now, this is reportedly a T-90 tank being struck and attacked by a Bradley using its 25mm chain gun. I'll just play that again for you. There is a longer video of this. There is a longer video which shows the tank after this attack here, the turret of the tank spinning around. It looks like it's almost spinning around sort of uncontrolled, and that perhaps it has been, it's been damaged to some extent, the control of the turret. I'm not sure if that's what has happened, but it looks a bit like that. But this is an interesting video. If this is a T-90 tank, because in the longer video, what you see happen is the T-90 seems to run off and crash into a tree and stop, and the crew members all get out and run away. So this if it is a T-90, which I think people think it is, you can see it's survived a pretty heavy onslaught from the Bradley and its 25mm chain gun, and the tank gets struck multiple times. The crew members all survive, and I say that because you see the video of them getting out and running away. They don't run 2 steps and fall to the ground dead. They seem to get out okay from this. The tank obviously suffers some damage and loses this fight. It loses this encounter because the crew runs away out of it. But in many respects, I think this is a good example to show just how durable that tank is. It was just receiving hit after hit after hit from the Bradley. I don't know why the tank itself didn't manage to engage with the Bradley. Perhaps the Bradley snuck up on it and just started hitting it while it was looking the other way. I'm not sure. And then maybe one of those attacks did something to the turret which didn't allow the tank to respond. I don't know. We might find out in the future if the crew were able to escape and survive. We might find out actually what happened. But it's an interesting video because there are two sides to this on Telegram channels. There are the pro-Ukrainians who are going, look, what a piece of rubbish this T-90 tank is. A Bradley took it out. They're useless. But on the other side, there's this conversation, well, hang on. Yeah, it did get struck. It lost this battle, but people who have reviewed this are saying, from what they can tell, the damage that's been done to the tank is minimal, that this tank could be repaired in the field and get back to fighting. It seems as though a lot of what was sort of seeming to explode off the tank was its reactive armour and then possibly smoke pots. So the tanks carry smoke pots, which it can fire to create a smoke screen and get out of there. And that some of them was that, or flares being smoke flares exploding off it. Before, in the longer video, shortly after this, as I say, it looks to crash with the turret doing something unusual. So some damage to the turret control may have happened. But the thing certainly didn't stop. In some of the reporting, it was that they believe that the likely target on the tank was the tracks, is what the Bradley would have or should have been aiming for. And if it was hitting the tracks, that they didn't seem to stop the tracks. The tank was able to continue to maneuver and the crew got out alive. So yeah, and it's just an interesting video, that one, as to whether it was really a good or a bad one for the tank. Look, I'll just quickly now go through the frontline update. This is the Russian Ministry of Defense update. We get this weekly summary once a week. As I always say, this is the Russian Ministry of Defense reporting, so choose to take this with the level of skepticism that you feel is warranted. You don't have to believe this. But I will now just say, to counteract some of the criticism of this, the Ukrainian Interior Minister has come out this week and said, let's tell the truth, we're losing 1,000 men a day, so 7,000 men a week, 30,000 men a month. That's what the Ukrainian Member of Parliament is saying. If we use this Russian Ministry of Defense weekly summary reporting and their estimate for the number of Ukrainian men killed and wounded, that's what the Ukrainian Interior Minister was saying, we're losing 1,000 killed and wounded, or 7,000 killed and wounded a week. The Russian Ministry of Defense, and this number I'll read out in just a moment, is consistent with what we've seen over the last 8 to 10 weeks. This week, the Russian Ministry of Defense is suggesting that 5,645, 5,500 Ukrainian servicemen were killed or wounded. That number is less than what the Ukrainian Interior Minister has claimed the Ukrainians are losing. So this, and for other reasons, is why I choose to report on this Russian Ministry of Defense figures each week, because they don't appear to be wildly fantastic. They're less than what the Ukrainians themselves from their government are now claiming are the Ukrainian losses. And they are at least consistent in their reporting, and they provide information which you can go and verify. You can look at the claims of, hey, in the Kherson region, an MLRS rocket system was destroyed. If you want to, you can take the time and you can go and look, and you can find geo-located video indicating that, yes, from another source, here's the video footage of a Lancet striking an MLRS in Kherson this week. So this is just the weekly summary numbers. This isn't the daily one from yesterday. This isn't one from the past 24 hours. But just summarize it. 5,600 men reportedly lost by the Ukrainians in this week's fighting. And over the last 8 to 10 weeks, it's varied between that number and 4,500 to 5,500. 94 pieces of artillery. Now, earlier this week, when I looked at a couple of the daily reports, it looked as though that number might be getting lower. 2 weeks ago, it was 116 pieces reported. The week after that, I think it was 49 or 54 pieces reported destroyed. This week, it's come up again to 94. What I did notice in this week's daily reports were a large number of self-propelled pieces of artillery reportedly destroyed. And this seems to be a shift. This seems to indicate that the Russians perhaps are winning the counter battery artillery duels and are now either with a preponderance of reconnaissance drones and with the declining frontline air defence and loss of electronic warfare anti-drone capabilities for the Ukrainians, that the Russians are now able to better target the mobile self-propelled pieces of artillery, and the Russians seem to be picking those off at a higher frequency. But anyhow, this week, the Russians reporting that the Ukrainians lost 94 pieces of artillery. Now, for Ukraine, losing artillery pieces now is very dangerous. And the main reason being, that I'm suggesting, is because of the recent couple of weeks of heavy missile strikes in Ukraine by the Russians. We have multiple reports that those missile strikes have been aimed at things like repair facilities, manufacturing and fabrication facilities. So if you've got pieces of artillery equipment at the front line, they get used, they get damaged, but maybe not destroyed, you've got to send them back to somewhere to repair them. Now, if your repair industries and locations and buildings are destroyed because of Russian missile strikes, you can't repair them. If you can't repair them quickly, you can't get them back to the front line. So you have less at the front line. So in a counter battery duel, you're losing another piece. Now, maybe one of them's destroyed, another one's damaged. So I believe the Ukrainians are probably starting to pile up damaged pieces of artillery, which they can't repair. And they can't replace because they're not getting artillery anymore from their Western supporters. You know, what they're getting now is ammunition, air defense systems, bombs, some missiles, trucks, trailers. They're not getting heavy pieces of artillery anymore. They're not getting big, heavy armored equipment. They're not getting lots of tanks anymore. So as the Ukrainians lose these pieces, it's harder and harder for them to replace them. As they are damaged, it's harder and harder for them to repair them. So I think the Ukrainians are starting to on a downward slide here in terms of artillery, while the Russians are able to continue to replace lost pieces. The Russians, I had reporting this week of them introducing the Kolitsia, the new big self-propelled Russian artillery piece, which has got a range of 70 kilometers, which outranges just about anything that in the self-propelled space that the Ukrainians have. And these are starting to come to the front line. So the Russians overpowering the Ukrainians in terms of artillery, it seems. Now, this is happening all along the front line, and it's not just artillery pieces that are being destroyed too. In Kupiansk, 8 armoured vehicles, 10 tanks in the last week, 2 ammunition depots. In Krasny Liman, 1 tank, 21 armoured fighting vehicles, 34 motor vehicles. In Donetsk, 2 Strela anti-aircraft missile launchers, 17 tanks, 27 armoured fighting vehicles, 86 motor vehicles. Also reports in Donetsk region around Avdiivka this morning, reports that Avdiivka is the long, thin settlement just to the west of Donetsk city. The Russians have been forming pincers and encircling it. It's heavily fortified, has been since 2014, but reports today that the Russian forces from the southern pincer have been able to cross the gap and reach the outskirts of Avdiivka from that southern pincer now. So more reports will come of that over the next day, I suppose, to see whether they are able to hold that position, or if they've just got there, they're going to be pushed back out by the Ukrainians. I don't know, but they're making advances in Avdiivka. So 2 Strela anti-aircraft missile launchers in South Donetsk, 6 armoured fighting vehicles, another Strela anti-aircraft missile launcher, so 3 of them lost on the front line, 24 motor vehicles. Zaporozhye, where the fighting seems to be moving up from Rabotino to Verbova, the Russians now starting to inflict damage around Malaya Tokmacha, which is north of those areas. 9 armoured fighting vehicles, 16 motor vehicles. And in the Kherson direction, there are 29 motor vehicles and 25 field artillery guns lost. So it does seem as though in Kherson, the Ukrainians were planning to push across the river. I think that is the case. A couple of months ago, there was bridgeheads tried to be established at Kazachi Halari. That was stopped, and then the Krynki one started. And it does seem as though the Ukrainians did have forces building up there, and the Russians seem to now be shooting across the river and destroying artillery pieces across the river in larger numbers in Kherson, it seems. So overall, the week of fighting for the Ukrainians has been similar to the previous weeks. It hasn't been going well. There's been large losses. Now, of course, there have been losses for the Russians, but as I say, I believe that the Russian losses are probably an order of magnitude less. You know, if the Ukrainians have lost 5,500 men, then the Russians maybe have lost 500 men across the front line. If the Ukrainians have lost 94, nearly 100 pieces of artillery, then maybe the Russians have lost 10 pieces. I'm saying this because this is just the feel that I'm getting. I've been through this before in previous videos using lots of different numbers as to why that might be the case. But at this stage of things, that would be my gut feel if I had to estimate things. I'd say it's probably getting to an 8-1 or a 10-1 difference. And I'll just finish up now. Just two topics that have been going around. Lloyd Austin. Still no pictures of the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. No videos, no pictures of him. Reuters has announced a fact-checking article claiming there is no substance to the idea that Austin was killed in Ukraine. The Defense Department on its website has given a written statement that Lloyd Austin spoke to his Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, yesterday. But still no words, no pictures from Lloyd Austin. And I did a little bit of digging. And this is by no means great statistics. But I've got a link in the description if you want to go and have a look yourself. If you look at the US Department of Defense website and you go into the news menu and you look at the releases section, you can see the brief releases that are given each day. If you wind back to like the 18th of December, something back there, and you look at each day, little releases come out. Hey, Lloyd Austin spoke to this person. Lloyd Austin spoke to that person. The Undersecretary, Kelly, spoke to this person. Prior to about the 22nd of December, Lloyd Austin's doing at least one, sometimes two, sometimes three of these calls a day are being announced. You know, there's defense. The website is saying he spoke to this person, he spoke to that person. From the 6th of January until today, which is nearly 2 weeks now, it's the 20th of January, so it's 14 days, that 2-week period, there have been 3 releases in total relating to Lloyd Austin. So prior to about the 18th or even on Christmas Day, the 25th, he had an announcement. But he was doing at least one a day, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. At least from the 6th until now, or even before the 6th perhaps, from about the 1st until now, there's been like 3 releases. So something has happened. You know, something has happened to Lloyd Austin to severely incapacitate him. Even now, after weeks of rehabilitation for a urinary tract infection, he's not operating at the level that he was. He's not talking to the people like at the level that he was before, if we believe the Defense Department website releases, which they were previously releasing them in larger number for him. So something is going on that has stopped him being able to work. Now, the US is saying, oh, no, he's working from the hospital bed and working from home now because he's been released and he's fine. He's got all the secure communications he needs to continue his normal operation. However, Congress doesn't seem to fully believe this. He has now been called to testify before Congress to explain his absence from his command. The House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mike Rogers has mailed Austin on early this week to attend a February the 14th hearing. So we've got until February the 14th, which isn't that far away. before we might actually see Lloyd Austin. And it will be interesting to see just how he looks and how he moves at that hearing. And I am beginning to wonder, this thought kind of came to me yesterday, but I'm beginning to wonder, is maybe Lloyd Austin being set up as the scapegoat for Joe Biden here? The Ukraine conflict hasn't gone well for the West, and more people are recognising that. Biden's got an election coming up. It's likely that Ukraine is going to be that dead albatross around his neck as he tries to get there, and Trump's going to beat it into him that, he's done really badly in Ukraine. Maybe if they're able to say, you know what, Lloyd Austin, he went rogue. He didn't talk to the president. He didn't tell him what was going on. He didn't listen to the president. The president said, do this, don't do that. We don't need to spend that much money. We need to look after our borders. But Lloyd Austin forced the president to do it. He gave him his word, his guarantee. Maybe they're going to load all that onto Lloyd Austin, and Lloyd Austin's going to be out. Whether or not he got damaged in a missile strike in Ukraine, or it really was some extremely long-winded and unusual injury due to his prostate surgery and a urinary tract infection, maybe Lloyd Austin's getting set to be cut loose and become the patsy and make Biden look better. Don't know. I'm speculating here. You know what I do? I like to speculate. Maybe that's what's going to happen. And then just the last thing, and this isn't me speculating, this is something which John Helmer, with his Dancing with Bears website, very good to read, very insightful. You should check it out. But on the 2 Navy SEALs that went missing in the Gulf of Aden there hasn't been any update on them that I've seen in the last day. The CENTCOM, Command Centre of Operations in that area, have said they won't release any more statements until the search and rescue mission for them is completed. That hasn't reportedly occurred. This story, I don't know if it's true or not, but John Helmer indicates that they weren't Navy SEALs trying to climb a boat. They were Navy pilots of an F-18, and it was shot down by the Houthis. And he claims in his article that a lot of the Lloyd Austin noise and other activity is to keep the focus off this, because this is the first time that an aircraft like this has been shot down by the Houthis in this nature, in this kind of scenario. I don't know if this is the case. I had a look around, and it was difficult to find any corroborating reports about them being F-18 pilots. But the story itself, lots of people are questioning it. It's like, I got a comment from someone who has said before had claimed they were in the SAS, the British Secret Service, and they were suggesting that on a mission like these guys were on, if they were trying to board a ship, they would have had tracking devices on them so that they could be located if need be. That does make sense to me, that you would do that. You would think, even if you get to the point where you're captured and you've got a tracking device, let's just say, I'm making this up, but let's just say it's a simple watch type tracking device. Well, you put your hand out and your captors cut it off and they do what they want. They pretend that you're over there. Fine. Or you tell it to destroy itself or something just before you're captured, so that you can't send back incorrect information of where you are. Or you keep it on. But it seems weird that the Americans don't know where these guys are. Anyhow, interesting one. Hopefully we'll find out more about that. Anyhow, it's the weekend. I hope you have a great weekend. If I get time, I will do a Middle East update today as well. But look, I hope you have a good weekend. I hope you're enjoying this channel. I'm enjoying doing the videos. If you do enjoy it and you know someone else that you think would like it, please share the video with them, because I'm trying to grow the channel. But have a good weekend, and I look forward to talking to you soon.